You kind of have to keep that to yourself because it's a delicate sensation, and if you share it with others, someone will destroy it. Therefore, it's best to keep everything within. Imagine this. Bob Dylan, who is now 84 and famously reticent on most topics, eventually chooses to speak as the sun sets over Malibu's tangled coast. But not about awards or politics. No, it's personal today. Dylan is opening the vault on Paul Simon, who was once his shadow, rival, equal, and resentful mirror for the first time in decades. This was more than a casual remark or a mysterious line. Dylan's disclosure, which revealed a cold conflict between two of the most complicated artists in American music history, was like removing decades' worth of dust from an old wound. Jealousy, charges of creative theft, love triangles, and unresolved resentment that had long been hidden beneath courteous interviews and public smiles were hidden behind the harmonies and guitar strings. It's startling to fans. To those closely observing, however, it was unavoidable. Imagine the early year 1960 in Greenwich Village. Coffee shops filled with optimistic young people huddled together, denim jackets, and protest music. Already, Bob Dylan was turning into a legend. Paul Simon followed. Accurate, driven, and utterly fixated on songwriting. Simon, however, desired perfection in contrast to Dylan's enigmatic lyrics and rugged rebel persona. He was astute and calculating. He seemed like a man who couldn't abide being second best even at the age of 23. From the beginning, there was friction behind the scenes. Dylan thought Simon's mannerisms were too refined and acceptable to the establishment. Simon, meanwhile, felt that Dylan was given too much credit for his flaws. He allegedly once sneered at a pal, folk messiah. More like a poet with a knack for timing who mumbles. As Dylan's fame grew more rapidly, more dramatically, and more mythically, that animosity only grew. Dylan had a revolution, but Paul Simon had the sound of quiet. The scene was set for a rivalry tinged with pride, jealousy, and subdued animosity rather than friendship. Dylan was not the subject of Paul Simon's most well-known quarrel. It was with Art Garfunkel, who had an angelic voice. They were harmony and poetry to the world. A boiling pot of ego, wrath, and control lurks behind the curtain. Although he wrote the lyrics and composed the music, Simon always believed that he bore the intellectual burden of the pair, whereas Garfunkel received the praise. Simon sulked in the background while his golden voice took center stage. It was a seismic breakup in 1970. However, many were unaware of how intimate the breakup went when Garfunkel acted in Catch-22 without telling Simon. It was war, not simply treachery. He was never really forgiven by Simon. Their few reunions were nasty, transactional, and stressful. If people's general impression of me in the public eye was that I was either sick or inebriated. Their chemistry was once compared to frost in the springtime by a close aide. Paul Simon's intermittent affair with Star Wars actress Carrie Fisher is perhaps well known to you. Many people are unaware of how emotionally damaging that connection was. Their 1983 marriage soon devolved into psychological warfare, obsession, and jealousy. Simon's demand for order and control contrasted with Fisher's struggle with addiction and mental illness. Despite their inability to separate, they divorced in less than a year. Years passed, filled with arguments, passion, and traumatic reunions as the toxic draw persisted. It was not a poetic tale of love. Everything was in disarray. Friends frequently described their bond as poisonous yet magnetic, like two wires igniting a fire in a pitch-black room. Simon didn't have many supporters in the music industry because of his perfectionism. Producers and session musicians frequently grumbled behind the scenes about his harsh demands and icy manner. He repeatedly re-recorded individual lines. He had a reputation for abruptly terminating employees. Working with him might be like walking on shattered glass, according to engineers. Then there were those who were critical. Simon was frequently criticized of being overly analytical, even sterile, whereas Dylan was commended for being honest and unvarnished. His ego took a serious hit when he received mixed reviews for albums like Hearts and Bones. Simon reportedly called a journalist at midnight to argue a 3-star rating after he became fixated on reviews. Although Paul Simon kept his family life mostly hidden, it wasn't quiet. For years, he had a tense relationship with his brother Eddie Simon, who was also a musician. They made an effort to work together on business endeavors, although they regularly disagreed on matters of financial and creative direction. Eddie once compared the situation to two captains attempting to control a single ship while constantly moving in opposing directions. They apparently went years without speaking to each other personally at one time because of how deeply they disagreed. As he grew older, there were also rumors of conflict with his kids. According to reports, Simon's high standards caused a rift, particularly with his kids, who found it difficult to emulate his enormous musical career. According to insiders, he was a parent who showed his love through rigidity rather than tenderness. He never allowed them to fail. Instead, he pushed them to be the best. There wasn't much room for their individual identities in the shadow of his greatness. Although it ended gently, his first marriage to Peggy Harper left him emotionally damaged. Harper Simon, their son, too pursued music but was frequently subjected to comparisons that he couldn't avoid. Interviews suggested a father absorbed by the studio and plagued by his legacy, as well as pressure and emotional absence. Family get-togethers were described as formal, structured, and short, even after Simon entered semi-retirement. Schedules and practiced small conversation took the place of the warmth that was expected at a family dinner. According to several intimate acquaintances, Simon found it difficult to be vulnerable, even in private. Even during quiet times, one is constantly thinking and editing. Ultimately, the author of some of the 20th century's most personal songs struggled to find genuine connection in his own house. In addition to being his haven, the studio served as a means of escape from his intricate, unresolved familial ties, expectations, and connections. During the 2000s and 2010s, Paul Simon did not quite embrace the emergence of new musicians. He openly disparaged various contemporary genres, calling out current trends as meaningless noise and critiquing hip-hop for its sampling. Young musicians didn't like this, and Simon became more and more cut off from the changing music business. He publicly argued with artists like Kanye West and even questioned the songwriting abilities of up-and-coming artists like Ed Sheeran. When a speaker at a 2014 music panel hailed modern rap as the new poetry, he reportedly rolled his eyes and remarked in private that people had forgotten what true songwriting was. He allegedly said, "It's not that I'm against youth," when he declined to attend a music awards ceremony honoring a younger pop act. "I oppose disguised mediocrity." Stories like these proliferated in industrial circles, portraying him as a bitter icon who defied time itself. Even though he was never properly cited in public, ideological as well as musical tensions increased. Simon questioned if contemporary musicians could really grasp the essence of their craft and bemoaned the development of social media-driven fame. In result, younger artists started to view Simon as a gatekeeper, too arrogant to transmit the torch, rather than a hero. The gap between generations grew, even if some people continued to admire his accomplishments. A man whose unparalleled legacy now clashed loudly with a cultural transformation he refused to comprehend or accept. Paul Simon had become a lone figure. Paul Simon is still a master of music. However, beneath the praise and classic tunes is a man tormented by insecurity, fixated on posterity, and damaged by decades of strained relationships and acrimonious conflicts. He was a man who was unable to let go of his resentment, his need for dominance, and his desire to be the most intelligent person in the room. Working with him was a combination of amazement and fatigue, according to even his closest associates. He carefully considered each note, questioned each harmony, and frequently made revisions to songs after they were completed. Being creatively dominant was not only a professional but also a personal necessity. Simon put up a wall between himself and other people because of his fixation with perfection. He was shielded from vulnerability by that wall, but genuine closeness was also excluded. His expectations caused friendships to fall apart, relationships to break down, and trust to be undermined. Millions of people enjoyed his music, but the guy who created it frequently felt cut off from the world. What many insiders had been whispering for years was only confirmed by Bob Dylan's statements. Despite his brilliance, Paul Simon suffered severe injuries. A man who never experienced genuine affection for his true self. A man who used perfection rather than happiness as a yardstick for success. A man who was more afraid of being irrelevant than of failing. And a man whose most intense disputes were with himself rather than the outside world. Paul Simon ultimately left a legacy that few people could match. His lyrics continue to reverberate throughout time, and his music is woven into the fabric of contemporary sound. But there was a cost to brilliance. A friendship was shattered at each standing ovation. A silent feud for every flawless melody. A restless night wondering if it was enough for each hit album. There is more to Simon's tale than just music. It's about the human cost of perfection, the weight of brilliance, and the pain of pride. And now that Dylan has finally illuminated the shadows hiding beneath that smooth exterior, the world views Paul Simon as more than simply a songwriter, rather, as a man who has dedicated his life to finding peace in a world full of conflict. Although his career would never die, his path was dirty, lonely, sad, and human. Despite appearing on the biggest platforms, he frequently left by himself. Although he worked to create the sounds of generations, he found it difficult to create inner serenity. That could be the paradox of genuine talent. Although it can't always get away from the chaos inside, it can sometimes bring beauty out of disaster. And as his public life comes to an end, a man who dedicated his life to his craft and paid for it in sacrifice, grief, and quiet is all that is left a bittersweet echo. Ultimately, that might be Paul Simon's most eerie tune of